Okay, so I still want to talk a little bit about scientific racism just briefly. If you're watching this at home, by the way, there is no video for Tuesday, so don't worry about it if you were stressing about that. You didn't miss anything, so. Okay, getting back to any questions, by the way, about the class in general, things coming up, anything like that, yeah?
The literature review, like what is that?
I'm just looking for you guys to go and do some literature on it. I can go over that real quick. Go look into what your topics that you guys chose, so. This room has more remotes than any other room I teach in. Seven remotes? Seems like a lot. This has 2 monitors. Hello. I need to turn off some of the lights. Can you guys see that well enough? Okay. So if you look, the literature review is due next week on Friday. So all I'm looking for you to do is to go out and find your sources. So you're not like necessarily writing anything. I'm just looking for you to provide me with, probably would be best is to do a bibliography, right, of whatever you find, just because then it'd be done and you can just plug it onto your paper when you're done. But I'm looking for you to go out and find 10 to 15 sources related to your topic. So you don't have to have them ready yet, right? Like once you get them, then you can slowly start reading them in preparation of writing your paper, right? At your own pace. So like don't feel like I'm sending you out to do a massive amount of work yet. I'm just looking for you to find them and report back, right? So I like to break down the term paper into steps, right? Because rather than thinking about it as, especially for upper division students, rather than thinking about it as something that like, normally when we write in undergrad, we learn to like write the night before, turn it in, and then it's done, right? And that's actually like not how writing works at all usually, right? So it's a lot, really, it teaches us some really bad habits in how to write. Writing usually happens slowly, and like in stages, and like it's revision, right? So like if you look at the syllabus, you know, I have you doing a lit review. I have you doing a term paper. Your term paper is actually due kind of in the middle of the semester, right? It's due in October. And then I am going to give you a series of revisions that you're going to have to do. Now, the one in October, like that's not a rough draft. That's your finished product. What I want you to turn in is what you would normally turn into a course as a finished product, right? anything less than that, you'll probably lose some points, right? So like I'm expecting a finished product, and then from there I'm going to revise it for you, give you advice. And not, when I say revise it, I'm not an English teacher. I don't particularly like grammar or anything like that, so I'm not gonna like go through and be like, here's a comma splice. Like maybe if I notice it, I might throw it in there just as like, oh, you had a comma splice here. It's gonna be more, I'm gonna more focus on things like when you use confusing wording, right? But I'm also gonna focus on mostly content, right? Does this make sense? Does it not make sense? Does this seem to line up with what other people are saying about it? If not, like, what are some issues you might have to address? Things like that, right? I used to be an editor, one of the editors for a journal. Did you guys know that? In graduate school, I was an assistant editor for Current Perspectives in Social Thought. So like, this is something that I've done a lot of, right? And like, no matter how well you write something, it deserves feedback, right? Because like nothing usually happens in a bubble. So that's kind of the philosophy, right? So it's getting you guys working on your paper really early, working on it slowly, developing it, and fixing it up, right? Like, so that's more what writing is actually kind of about. So like if you guys, anybody here interested in going to grad school at all? Like maybe, possibly. A few of you guys, in graduate school, often you'll only have one assignment in the course, and you'll just be expected to be doing it through the entire semester. So like you'll take a class like, especially if you're doing it in sociology or criminology, because criminology programs are generally just sociology programs with focuses in criminology. You'll take a class on, I don't know, take a class on poverty, right? You'll be expected to develop some sort of long-term paper on poverty. You know, usually they're probably about 30 pages, 30, 40 pages-ish. But you'll spend the entire semester working on it, right? Your only other homework will be doing the readings for class and showing up, which they won't actually grade you on, they just expect you to do it. Right? So if you think about like different habits of mind, if you will, different ways of approaching writing, right? Like partially the reason why I like to break it down like this is I like to essentially set us up for better forms of writing. Learning to write well is also good regardless of your profession. If you go into the government as opposed to like going into academia, especially if you go up, you're probably going to have to write reports. And you're probably going to have to think about your reports more like how you would write this, as opposed to something you just do at the last minute and turn in for a grade, right? So like, we're just setting us up to think about our writing in a different way. But anyways, so the only thing that I'm looking for you in summary is 10 to 15 sources on your topic. If you are researching it and you realize your topic doesn't seem to have enough on it, or like you're moving in a wrong direction and you want to switch, like you can go ahead and do that. You can do that in the moment. You don't have to report back with me per se. Just give me the list of whatever sources you want, right? And then, like I said, you can start when you have a little extra time, when one course is a little weaker in its assignments or whatever, until we get closer to the term paper, you can slowly read these on your own, and think about, right? And that's really like good writing comes from good thinking, right? Thinking about your topic slowly as you interact with what other people have said on it, right? Does it make sense? Yeah.
If like after we turn this in and we realize like, oh, some of these sources, like they're just not very helpful, like I need to find new ones, like is that okay?
Yeah, and you don't even need to use all 15 or all 10 of them in your actual paper. So like, yeah, you might read them and be like, this is about something complete, like it's connected, right? It's on the same topic, but yeah, this isn't going to help me with what I actually am interested in writing on. That happens all the time, right? But like, and that's why like maybe towards the 15 might be a better idea, especially if you're not 100% sure you're going to use all 10 of them. You move towards the 15, you got kind of extras to spare. You can burn through them and not read them if they're not useful to you. So once again, this should be on some level fun. I know that sounds like a silly thing to say about a writing assignment, but on some level this should be fun because you're looking into something you like, right? That's why you picked it. So like to some degree, this is an excuse to do exploration. Other questions? Let's not do this Friday, let's do the Friday after, so you have a pretty good time to find stuff. Oh, one last thing. Did I tell you guys about my rules for scholarly sources already? I did? Okay, so you guys know about the stricter standard. That doesn't mean you can't use other sources, but they're just not going to count towards this, right? So these will just be books and you know, if you want recommendations on things you could include, I'm more than happy to share things I have. I may or may not know of any of the literature, but like this I think might have been a different class, or like a good example, like I'm aware of some of the stuff on, a lot of the stuff on eugenics. Somebody was talking about doing sort of like a eugenics like thing on abortion, basically. Like, is it something other than coincidental that abortion clinics are in poor neighborhoods? Which I thought was a really interesting question. I think one thing you should, not to like, this is just me thinking, I thought about this earlier today, right? Like, one thing you should avoid is giving intentionality, right? Like, more of this cultural logic kind of argument, right? Like, we see that a lot in our racism stuff, right? There's a logic to racism. It's not, like, this isn't a class about racists, right? This is a class about racism. You know, and you think about that as more of a like, and that's often with a lot of your topics, right? Things are not necessarily intentional. They're often institutional, and we aren't even aware we're doing it, right? So we kind of like, another way to put it, like, often as we go about our day-to-day lives, we reinforce really negative things about our societies without ever realizing we're doing it. But anyways, I was thinking about that while I was chopping up vegetables for my lunch today. Okay, any other questions about the class before we plunge forward into our readings? Yeah?
So for the sources, they should just be like peer-reviewed?
Yeah, peer-reviewed journals and books.
Okay.
That's what I would include at this stage. But yeah, if you find like a newspaper article and it's like super interesting and relevant or something like that, right? Like, you can use it. It just probably shouldn't count towards a scholarly source, and you should be careful about how you use it, because you should treat it like the information in it isn't as accurate. You know, it doesn't mean you can't use it in some way. Okay, any other questions? Okay, great. Let's talk about our topic. So I was going to briefly kind of talk about scientific racism, kind of why it's important for us to understand scientific racism, as well as like some of the differences. And then we'll start on Collins. I don't know if we'll get through both chapters today. I kind of want to go through both of them a little bit slowly. I think they're really interesting chapters. And kind of pertinent to the, well, we'll get there. Okay, so scientific racism. So scientific racism is sort of like, so far when we've talked about racism, it's what we could almost kind of label like organic racism, right? Like, in that, if we think back to Arendt, like, it's this habit of being violent towards other people that births this idea of racism. But it doesn't stay there, right? And then, largely speaking, like, at that early period of racism, most of the people, this is on, by the way, isn't it? Just making sure. Yeah, okay. Most of the people in Europe are probably not particularly racist or aware of race early on. So if we're talking about in the 1600s, it's not on their minds, right? There's a slow sort of movement of those ways of thinking developed in the colonies into Europe. And part of that is the birth of scientific racism, where earlier sort of like, if you will, organic racism, right, doesn't have a ton of legitimacy. By the time we get to scientific racism, it does, right? Scientific racism lends the weight of science to racist ideology. Now, even though today we generally think of scientific racism as pseudoscience, so you're going to, you know, modern academics do not think that what scientific racism talked about was true. It still largely influences a lot of our racial thinking today. So it's really important for us to kind of, I guess, suss out like what was being said in the past about races, and then we'll try to, before we leap into Collins, try to think about how is that, right, connected to the way we often think about other races. So there's really three variants of scientific racism, and they're somewhat sequential. So you have polygenesis, monogenesis, and evolutionary. So polygenesis and organic racism are probably the closest related. Polygenesis often has its birth in people who become intellectuals from colonies. So this might be like people like medical doctors, stuff like that, right? And the original, and these would be people in, plantation owners in Jamaica, or people serving in, on plantations in the South in the United States. And so in the late 1700s, or mid-1700s, this idea of polygenesis starts taking root, which is the idea that different races have different origins. The 18th and 19th century, by the way, people are obsessed with origins. In language stuff, the most predominant form of language theories are things called comparative philology, where they're trying to suss out where did our languages come from, and can we trace them back to some like common language, right, that was spoken at one time, right? This is kind of like our ideas that float around a lot in the 17 and 1800s. And part of that literature ends up becoming this idea of biological races, and the claim is that different races have different origins. In other words, they originated from different species. What does that mean? Quite literally. If different races originated from different species, what does that mean about different races? What do you think? What's the ramification of that? They're not what?
They're not equal?
Well, yeah, in all of these, it's going to be unequal. Scientific racism is all about inequality. It's in a lot of ways like, lending legitimation to ideas about race, it simultaneously reinforces those relationships that were already built in colonies, right? What else is it? What else does it mean to say that different races originated from different? What does that mean? Like, anybody want to translate that into something even less abstract? What would it mean to say that different races originated from different species?
Kind of saying like we're not all like one human race, it's we're just like different types of race, like humans, if that makes sense, like. Yeah, different species. Essentially what that means is that there are different species of human. That's what polygenesis people think, and it's quite literally like 17, 1800s were already very strongly within biological science into sort of a form of evolutionary thinking. It's not the kind that's going to come later, which grows out of Darwin, right? But they very much so mean, quite literally, like different apes turned into different people, so they're not the same species at all, right? This is somewhat of a marginal theory, but it becomes wrapped up in this huge debate that lasts for over 2 centuries, which is the debate between polygenesis and monogenesis. Initially, one of the problems with polygenesis is different church bodies come out against it really strong and declare this sort of heretical as an idea, which is true early on, but then as essentially like later on, polygenesis actually becomes something promoted by a lot of church groups. So there's sort of a shift later on. Particularly amongst like certain branches of Protestantism, that they come out, and that's essentially attempting to undercut Darwinian evolution. So that happens later.
But initially it comes out strong again, the churches come out strong against it, which kind of squashes it a little bit. But even amongst elites that are not particularly religious, which are very common in the 18th century, right? You have some attitudes towards polygenesis. Okay, monogenesis. What's one of the big problems if you're going to say human beings are different species? Can anybody think? This came through in our. This is all out of Colonial Desire. Did anybody catch? This is one of the ways that our author talked about hybrid. The idea of the hybrid. I also feel like I need to say all of these theories are dangerous and bad. So no one at home listening to this in a video, I will promote absolutely none of these as something you should really think is true. But there's a problem with reproduction, right? Like, what happens if you breed two different species? This is just, I'm not meaning this. This is sort of the language of these theories. So, what happens if two different species procreate?
Their offspring are infertile.
Yeah, either they are not close enough genetically to even create offspring, or their offspring are infertile, right? Which would be something like, kind of like the classic example is like an ass, right? Like an ass is a donkey and a horse. And you breed them, and then they're infertile, like they can't reproduce on their own. You can't take two asses, breed them, and have another one be born. They're just sterile. And so, like one of the issues with polygenesis and sort of the birth of this debate, because initially people are just like, okay, yeah, sure, that's a good explanation for a race. And then really it starts with a French thinker by the name of Buffon, who's one of the founders of one of the founders of sort of like naturalist philosophy that modern biology grows out of, challenges this idea of the polygenesis basically being like, yeah, but people can reproduce with people from other races, so obviously we have to come from some common origin, right? We have to actually be closer genetically than what we would think, right? Than what early race theorists would claim. On the surface, that seems nicer, right? But it's not. It has actually in some ways, a more dangerous outcome. And so, one of the issues here is that. So I'll give you an example. I'll take an example of a monogenesis theory. Has anybody ever heard of Immanuel Kant? No. If you learn about Immanuel Kant, it will be in a completely different way than what I'm about to talk to. He's a major philosopher. You're very likely to learn about him in philosophy classes. If you're a Soc major, you'll learn about Immanuel Kant and Soc theory. But Immanuel Kant was also one of the early scientific racists. So like we have that too, which nobody usually talks about. And so if we were to take Kant's like theory of human races, it's that all human beings originated from what he calls the lineal root, right? And the lineal root was in Europe, of course, right? All the theories of race were very Eurocentric. And so the lineal root was in Europe. And from there, as people moved out, differences in temperature and humidity produced different types of humans. And so for Kant, there's four different types of humans other than the lineal root. And he refers to them as noble, blonde, red, yellow, and black. Very simplistic race system. Once again, we're still at the early origins of race. Like, we don't think about it this way, but early 1800s, we're talking about the very beginning in a lot of ways still, right? And that's how simple the system was. Anyways, so the idea is that as you moved out, you particularly adapted to whatever environment you're in. Well, for Kant, he was very worried that now that people were moving around more, that you would have interbreeding, which would in essence lead to the sort of like degradation of different races. So like for Kant, he was concerned that like, you know, if you are, you know, just feel like it's really hard to talk about scientific racism just because like you sound really racist when you try to explain how it works, right? And going back to like not promoting any of this, right? So anyways, his argument would be something like, you know, like if the people who are the black race were particularly well suited to live in Africa and they bred with white people, they would produce offspring which were neither good to live in Europe nor in Africa. So that's how Kant's system was. So there's an idea that you have to keep a certain level of racial purity so that you're still well adapted to your environment and the things that you have to do in it, right? And this is referred to as a degradationist argument, right? For those of you who are criminologists, and you took crim theory, do you guys remember learning about Lombroso? One of the founders of criminology. Lombroso is a degradationist, monogenesis degradationist theorist, right? So like his entire thing about like what creates crime is built into this idea of like degradation of races, right? And so it's a good example of how that works. So what does that mean for, well, I'll just let that flow. So these two go on debating with each other for quite a while, and the thing that ends the polygenesis-monogenesis debate is the birth of Darwinian evolution. And for Darwinian evolution, it thinks about races a little bit differently, and to some degree it just views this question as irrelevant. But it becomes interested in race in a very different way. So Darwinian evolution in a lot of ways abandons any attempt to like really talk about why races are different. And it abandons any idea of races being particularly connected to a specific environment. That is something you get from like Kant. And with Darwinian evolution, instead it's going to focus on biological adaptation. Let's just make sure we understand the basics of Darwinian evolution. So how aware are people of how evolution is supposed to work for Darwin? Sometimes we refer to it as natural selection. What's the theory of natural selection? Do you guys know? How does natural selection work? Anyone who wants to jump in? Yeah, go ahead.
Those who can acclimate to an environment will basically be killed off, so that way only those who can acclimate to it will pass on their genes.
Yeah. Yeah, so the idea of natural selection is that essentially a species will alter for its environment, right? And essentially if it has traits that hurt it. So essentially we're always gaining new traits, right? We mutate, right, basically, as a result of the way that genes basically work, and mutations most of the time kill you. And some of the time they're productive, right? So essentially, like, for Darwinian evolution, you have some sort of adaptation, I don't know, like, you know, your pigment changes, you gain an extra finger, like, whatever, right? Like, and either that's going to be beneficial or it's not to a specific environment. Those that are beneficial guarantee that they can reproduce. Those that are harmful cause you to die out, right? And so slowly things change over time. That's kind of Darwin's basic philosophy. Okay, so what does that mean for races? What do you think? How would you plot? What would happen if you just took Darwin's framework and plugged race difference into it?
Probably that some races have evolved better than others, maybe?
Yeah, that these are essentially different developments, right, as a result of adaptation. And some of them are better than others. What's going to naturally happen to things to the adaptations that are worse? Through competition.
They're gonna die?
They're going to die out. So Darwin essentially, his philosophy is that racial differences will eventually just disappear. And they're not going to disappear like in some sort of like post-racial future where everybody just learned to get along well enough to reproduce together, and so races became insignificant. Instead, they're going to die out through competition where the stronger will naturally kill off the weaker. Do you guys see how that becomes a major justification for some colonial policies? Right? So essentially this becomes like, if white Europeans, right, really believe that they're smarter than everybody else and more capable, it really means that they have a legitimate reason to kill off other people. It also marries this sort of degradationist philosophy, right? Because like, if you have better adaptations, if some groups are better adapted to others, they can only really be injured by reproducing with weaker people, right? So there becomes even more impetus, right, to avoid this sort of racial degradation. Taken to its extremes, Darwinian evolution, one generation later, becomes eugenics. Named after one of Darwin's students, Eugene Holton. Is anybody familiar with that word? What eugenics is?
Isn't it like trying to find the best like people to breed with the best people to like produce a good like human that's gonna be strong and like smart or whatever?
Yeah, well, and so sometimes the division that gets made is between positive and negative eugenics. And so positive eugenics is like, yeah, you try to encourage people to breed, right? One thing that Eugene Halton was a big fan of trying to do is like, essentially like giving financial rewards if like smarter or wealthier people bred with each other, right? Because essentially like you would be breeding better stock. He was very concerned about poor people outbreeding everybody else because he viewed them as inferior. What else might you do if you believe that you should be promoting? And so the idea is that within the race, right, like rather than just sort of leaving it up to nature, for eugenics, the idea is like, why don't we intervene with the scientific knowledge we have and make ourselves biologically superior, right? And so yeah, they promote things like breeding. In the United States, we had a eugenics policy for a while. We advocated doctors sterilize people, right? What groups of people get sterilized? People familiar with this history in the United States?
Didn't they disable those that were like, or they sterilized those that were disabled?
Yeah, disabled people would be sterilized, people who didn't score high. That's actually like one of the early uses of intelligence testing was essentially to decide whether to sterilize somebody, right? So intelligence testing, so like all that sort of stuff, the idea is like, well, let's get rid of any negative characteristics within us and then we'll make, essentially we'll make super babies or whatever, right? Also like things like but often eugenics gets practiced in other negative ways of like quite literally like euthanizing certain populations, right? And this could be also things like euthanizing people who are of mixed parentage, right? Things like that get promoted and sometimes done, right? So like that's essentially like if you were to take these three, these are kind of like the heavy hitters of scientific racism. We still often are pervaded by similar logics. How can we see something similar to this in modern societies, in a contemporary sense? How do we see continuation of scientific racism in our thoughts? Has anyone ever seen the movie Idiocracy? It's a movie from the 90s, a comedy. No? No one's ever seen this movie? The entire film, Idiocracy, is on this idea that like, essentially like, stupid people are outbreeding smart people, so someday we'll become like really dumb. And so he moves to the future, and it's like this dumb slacker in the 90s goes to the future, and everybody thinks he's brilliant. And he like rules the country basically, and like, you know, because everyone is just basically like an idiot, right? Idiocracy. That's a form of, like, that's essentially a eugenics-based argument, right? Like, anything, and you hear like sometimes like people will, and you hear this like in the news, right? You'll hear people talking about something like white people not breeding enough compared to other people, especially if you watch conservative news. This actually pops up as something that gets said. That's a eugenics argument, right? The idea that like, well, even the idea that like, you know, these clear categories, competition, right? The survival of the fittest kind of worldview, right? Still kind of pervades us. How else might you see a scientific racist philosophy still popping up? I mean, besides the fact that we still see races as clear categories, right? Clean-cut categories, which they're definitely not. And the history of them is not one, but one of actually like a lot of borrowing back and forth, both culturally as well as even if you're talking about genetic material, right? So like, there isn't this clear history of divided out people, we invent that. Most people in this room, if by like the standards of scientific racism, are probably from some form of mixed parentage, right, at some point. So there's often a kind of an allusion to that as well. Is anybody familiar with like the stuff with Scandinavia and testing of children? This may be another way that you see eugenics sort of stuff popping up. Hear this? Now you can basically test for a lot of different conditions before a child is born, right? You guys know this? You can do testing on an infant, figure out whether it has like various physical or mental ailments. And like often this is used as a reason to abort children, right? Which is very much so a eugenics philosophy. And there's actually like a whole movement amongst people who are disabled, who are like, you're essentially denying my right to exist, right? Like that you should be able to like figure out whether you have Down syndrome. It kind of means that people with Down syndrome don't have a legitimate life, right? But there's also an underlying idea that we'll be a better society if we don't have those people in it, right? Which is also like a form of basically degradationism, right? It's a form of it's very, very much so a eugenics philosophy, right? Does all make sense? So in short, scientific racism is becomes more legitimized because it throws the weight of science behind it, right? And it sort of, in a lot of ways, segments our racial philosophies, right? It sinks it in the ground, right? And that's, in some ways, the moment of scientific racism becomes the moment of truly accepting a racial form of difference, right? That before that, it was in the fringes, and now we've seen it sort of develop into something, right? And now we live in the aftermath of that. So everything that comes after this, right, is in essence an analysis of the continuation of this philosophy and the form of action it's tied to, right, into the present. Because rather than, and in a lot of ways you can already see this developing in our little lineage here of scientific racism, in some ways it becomes, over time, racism doesn't disappear, it becomes more subtle. And we'll see that continuing as a history. We live in just as racist of a society as this one, but it just doesn't look like it on the surface, right? It becomes quieter, more subtle, more hidden, more embedded in our institutions, right? But in some ways, the individual person becomes less racist. And I think you can see that kind of even in terms of these philosophies, how they change. Okay, any questions about that? Great, let's transition. So if you have your Collins book, go ahead and get it out. Are there any questions? Were there any questions or thoughts? Did I pause long enough? I didn't cut you guys off. Did anybody have any thoughts on scientific racism they want to share? No? Just making sure. Okay. So we should start talking about this chapter, we should back up a little and make sure we're all on the same page on what Collins has said so far. So, from your notes, from what you wrote in your book, from your thoughts, what have we been talking about so far for Collins? Because now we're getting into her applying what she's already said she's going to do. What's Collins' theory? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, intersectionality, and then bringing in like Mariah Stewart being in the book, and then using like the matrix of domination into that as well.
Yeah. So what is intersectionality? And the matrix of domination is sort of a related term. So what is Collins meaning by intersectionality? What's the best way to try to go about for Collins understanding racial, gender, and class differences? Is another way to put it. Do you think about these things separately? Should you think about these things separately? Let's try a different approach. So one of the things that Collins talks about a lot in the early chapters is sort of like going back and hearing black women's voices in history. Which at first on the surface sounds like it's just like an impulse like, oh, we should hear everybody's voice, which is not really how she means it. What's the significance of black women's voices for Collins? Why is it important to listen to them? These sort of people from the past that we've forgotten, have incomplete histories of. Why are they important thinkers to unlock, understand?
Oh yeah.
They have a better understanding of social constructs as a whole since they're in both social spheres.
Yeah, so the idea is that their standpoint alters, right, what in the past we've seen within discussions of race, class, gender, right? That when we kept them separate, we were getting only a weird little partial worldview. So that hearing that standpoint essentially illuminates part of history, right? The history of race, the history of class, and the history of gender, that otherwise you would be blind to. Right? Do you remember I was talking about the master-slave dialectic thing? What was the master-slave dialectic?
Is that like the slave understands the world better because he has to think about like himself and his master or something?
Yeah, so the idea is that there's also a significance, and Collins would want to make this claim, right? That like, in some ways, people who fall at a larger number of intersections understand our society better. Because in some ways, like, they can see the dark underworkings of it, right? The rest of, most people can manage to sort of skirt along the surface of the world and take it at face value. But people who find themselves in really like in the most oppressed positions within our society don't have that luxury. It's kind of the idea, right? So instead, like, their perspective really illuminates a lot. Well, that sounds like a great claim, but like, how do we know that, right? And that's kind of like, in a lot of ways, like, when you're reading something like this, like what I'm calling a monograph, right? A standalone book written by an intellectual that's nonfiction. This is usually the steps is that they present this theory, and they haven't displayed it yet. They haven't shown why they think this is true, right? They just present in the abstract. So for Collins, so far what she's done is she's presented us with intersectionality and the need to hear the most oppressed people's voices to understand society. That's her starting point, right? In the chapters you read for this week, she transitions from that sort of abstract level to actually showing us what that does when you use it. Right? So she's using that philosophy to understand two different things for this week, right? I think maybe I'll end up kicking the second one to the next class, right? But we'll start with the first one, which is the first one is essentially a history of work. So she's interested in history, and what she's constructing here is a history of Black women's labor. So that's what she's interested in here. And as you're going to see, there's a lot of intersectionality in here. What's something that gets talked about a lot in this chapter that doesn't necessarily have to do with work? Just sort of thumb through it. And here's where you're seeing sort of the part of the intersectionality. People look through it if you have something.
They kind of talked a little bit about like the combining of like work and family.
Yeah, so like here you see like there's a difference in talking about, and like there's all the history of labor is an important thing, right? And if you take like basic early, so like you're taking like, you know, Soc theory, right? Durkheim is a history of labor. Marx is a history of labor, right? So if you're thinking about it in that way, like the history of labor is well-tread ground, right? The history of race and labor is also fairly well-tread, right? But here we get like talking about that intersection. How is it that the family interrelates with the history of racial minorities' work, right? And that's really kind of what we're looking at here. Which is simultaneously both going to explain, for Collins, the way in which we talk about Black families today, mostly in a disparaging way, the disparaging way that we talk about Black families, which we really do. Like, we often, even in scholarly literature, if you're thinking about more like social work, psychology sort of end of things, often there's a lot of focus on things like the broken homes of racial minorities and things like that, and whether this contributes to, right, continuing poverty, right? Which in a lot of ways, like if you're looking at it from Collins' perspective, is really more of a justification of the continuation of a labor system, right? Rather than something that you can really lay at the door of Black people. We're going to see why that's the case, right? So pointing this out, like this interrelationship between the family system and the labor system over time, right? That's kind of the focus here. Any questions or thoughts so far? Is all that clear? So this discussion of family and work really picks up on page 53. So if you're following along, go ahead and turn to page 53. I think I might have you guys, somebody, if I can get a volunteer to read. This is going to be kind of a long section of reading, and I might pause that person at different points. Can I get a volunteer? I know I just said something intimidating and asked for a volunteer. Go ahead. So on page 53 from this, we're going to skip past the first couple sentences, but this paragraph that says Daniel Quayle at the first part, which feels a little dated. This book's 20 years old, so we'll skip over talking about Daniel Quayle. And go to, does anybody know who that is? He's a vice president. During the first Bush era. So quite a while ago. Anyways, with this from the word formed through a combination. Do you see where I'm pointing?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Formed through a combination of marital and blood ties, normal families should consist of heterosexual, racially homogeneous couples who produce their own biological children. Such families should have a specific authority structure, namely a father head earning an adequate family wage, a stay-at-home wife and mother, and children. Idealizing traditional family as a private haven from a public world, family is seen as being held together through primary emotional bonds of love and caring. assuming a relatively fixed sexual division of labor wherein women's roles are defined as primarily in the home, with men's in the public world of work. The traditional family ideal also assumes the separation of work and family, defined as a natural or biological arrangement based on heterosexual attraction. Instead, this monolithic family type is actually supported by government policy. It is organized not around biological core, but state-sanctioned heterosexual marriage that confers legitimacy not only on the family structure itself, but on children born in this family. In general, everything the imagined traditional family ideal is thought to be, African American families are not.
Okay, so what is she saying in this paragraph, if we were to sum it up? What is our expectations about families culturally?
Everybody looks like Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah, basically, yeah. We have a model of what families look like that grow out of the early 20th century, right? And was not true for most of the population and still is not, right? Who is it particularly true for, generally speaking? Who has nice, perfect nuclear families where one person stays at home and one person works?
Suburban white families.
Yeah, and so that's what she's kind of pointing out is like in some ways, like us support, like basically the way in which we talk about it is already itself. Remember when we talked about the idea of the other and the trace? Do you remember this? That when we make a positive statement, there's usually an implied other, right? It comes from Derrida. This is kind of what she's saying here, right? It's like we have a philosophy about the family, which is actually really intertwined with a philosophy on work life. Well, how do we see work life popping up in this paragraph? It's something we briefly mentioned last time we talked about Collins.
There's a sexual division of labor that's kind of only applied to white women because minority women tend to work.
Yeah, so there's a sexual division of labor, right, that's specific to people who are affluent enough to only bring in one income. This is even dying away amongst white people, right? Because, like, essentially, like, white people aren't even affluent enough anymore because of social stratification to actually, like, live off of one. Even when people want to stay home, they can't necessarily anymore, right? It's pretty actually rare to find families where people can afford to only bring in one income. But historically that's been true for most of the population, right? That they cannot live off of one of their incomes. So there's that, right? So the public and private world, right? This idea of having one sphere for one part of the family, another sphere for the other, right, is largely illusory. And often, like, the implied trace of that, if that's what's right and good, it means that all those poor people, all those racial minorities, all those other groups, immigrants that cannot maintain those type of family structure or traditionally didn't even have that type of family structure, right, are essentially viewed as, are otherized. They're viewed as negative and inferior. Okay. Just to back up, too, like, how old is that system? We talk about it like it's traditional. How old is the nuclear family way of living? You can see this in sizes of houses. Houses get smaller. Has anyone ever noticed this? Like, you drive out in the countryside here. What do the really old farmhouses look like? What do they look like? Or even like you walk down the street here, what do the old houses look like? Both the fancy and the ones that aren't fancy. What do they look like?
Like a lot of room and a lot of area for a lot of people to live in.
Yeah, they're huge. Why are they huge?
Families, big families.
Did the people who lived in that house, was it mom, dad, and children? No. We didn't live in nuclear families. We lived in extended families. right? Mom, dad, aunts, uncles, grandparents, all living in the same home often. You know, so like very different system, right? It's not until the early 20th century that you get this shift into a nuclear family. And the only other time in history that you have nuclear families at all being common is in some hunting and gathering societies. You live in nuclear families. Other than that, historically, people have not. People have not thought about their family ties that way, right? So, so thinking about like we're defining family in a very narrow way that only describes right now. And even to this day, a lot of people can't live like that. Okay, thinking about like, just to provide more context yet, why do people live in extended families, do you think? Why do people live in extended families? What's an advantage to living in an extended family?
So maybe more people are like helping pay for like the house or amenities, and then maybe somebody sits at home and does like childcare.
If somebody's got to work, they can, right? Like in an extended, well, traditionally everybody works. So if you think about like, you talk about like those old farm families, there's a sexual division of labor, but everybody's working. And most of them are working in and out of the home, right? So like that's a part of what's going on there. But yeah, you can pool your resources, both your labor, your time, your money, right? This is why, like, has anybody ever noticed it's cheaper to live in an apartment than it is to rent a house? Why is that? Well, you have one place of living, right? And then you have a lot of people chipping in, right? Many hands make light labor, right? So traditionally people lived in extended families as a safety net, right? So getting back to the idea of racial differences, what might be one reason why people have a more extended family outlook when they're poor or minorities? What do you think? Why would they do that? What's the reason? What do you think? Extended families amongst poor minorities.
If multiple people need to work, and there's like grandparents at home to take care of the kids, then all of the people who are of kind of working age can go out and work while there's somebody to watch the kids without having to pay for childcare or nanny or anything.
Yeah. Essentially, you can pool your resources of time and work, right? Like, and so like, where the sort of like middle class white ideal would not have your grandparents raising the children most of the time, right? Like we would look down on that. Maybe even look down on that over like something like paying for professional childcare, which seems really ironic if you start thinking about it, right? Like essentially these things are racialized attitudes, would be calling the Collins. So, but they also have a specific history, right? So like getting back to like the history of labor and household. Okay. So where does her history through here start? So she starts with this sort of broader claim, right, about the differences between families. And then really sort of like on page 55 is where she starts this sort of long history. Once again, this is an intersectional history. She's rereading history in a different way. We get sort of set stages that are commonly talked about in labor history of the United States though, which also gets us into thinking about race and how race changes in the US. Pretty well, so. Where does our story start with what? Which system of labor? How do women of African descent originally labor in the United States? It's an obvious question.
Slavery.
In slavery, right? What's the difference between a male and female experience of slavery? I'm just going to let that question float and we'll keep on going. Okay, so it starts out, and there's a discussion, right, of how in the transition from Africa to being enslaved, ways of thinking that are very African alter into something new. You guys catch this history at all? This starts really on the second paragraph of page 55, or second paragraph in that, the process of enslavement. What's a problem with having families during slavery? Modern slavery, not ancient slavery. You guys know this. This is just common history. Hey, how you doing? So what's the what class are you here for, man? What's that? I think you might be. This is race and ethnicity, so. Okay. Have a good day. I think you're in one of my other classes, aren't you? See you this afternoon. He's in my research methods class, I think. So, okay, so getting back to how is, so what's one of the difficulties of having families in slavery? What can people do?
You take the chance of getting split up, like, if they sell one of them, and that they keep, like, the husband or the kids.
Yeah, that essentially, like, your family relationships are mostly unstable, right? So, like, at any point, people can be sold, right, off, basically, and your family unit could have to change. Okay, so thinking, did anybody catch this thing about bloodlines being replacing the notion of blood? Did anybody see this section in this paragraph? Okay, so does anybody want to venture a guess of what this is talking about? This is the transition and how, yeah.
Is it like when they talked about when they were together as slaves, like that group who worked together was more or less their family rather than like the availability of actually having like a real family because of like just the consequences of the system of slavery?
Yeah, so that's the outcome. That's the when it turns into blood, like essentially what it allows them is like they can cast a really wide net at who gets to be in the family. Can you see why that would be advantageous in a system with unstable families? So like anybody who's living around you of African descent becomes family, right? Is this a traditional notion, African notion of families? It's kind of a... In reality, both yes and no are correct. It's an adaptation of something. So, is anybody familiar with like how people, like, is going back to like, we're talking about did anybody here take it used to be sociology of culture, now it's cultural anthropology. Did anybody take this class? No one in here took this. In talking about the nuclear family being something fairly novel, right? If we're talking about African societies, they have a specific way of thinking about family, right? And so like there's a lot of different ways throughout history of thinking about family. And one of these has to do with mostly like thinking about your bloodlines, what are referred to by anthropologists as lines of descent. Has anyone ever heard of this? This is where you ever hear like matrilineal, patrilineal, right? That sort of stuff, right? So sometimes you draw your family through the female line, sometimes you draw it through the male line. Anybody study this in any of your social classes at all? This is sort of basic comparative stuff for families, right? And I'm not saying we need to know the details of that. I'm just bringing it up to see if anybody... So the idea is that you would traditionally think about your family as extremely extended, right? And often has to do with the way in which property, rights, privileges passes between people. Often like in very different variations. So like if you pass down the female line and you don't recognize male relatives, your father might not be your closest male relative, it might be your uncle, right? So these are very common like forms of descent in traditional African societies, are these sort of large extended systems of understanding your family, right? And in fact, like often you'll have a pretty strong idea of hundreds of people that you're related to and exactly how you can treat and what you have to do for every single one of them, This is what she's alluding to with this idea of bloodlines, right? So you have this system, right, where in a lot of ways it's very specific, but it's big and extended, right? Very different than the white families of the settlers, right? And so when they come over to Africa, they kind of keep the same extended notion of rights and privileges and getting help and sharing resources and stuff that comes out of that big system. But what they do instead is they universalize it so that as people get moved around and stuff, essentially they can formulate this concept of sort of a community out of whatever slaves are present. Does that make sense? So that's part of the system in play here, right? So she's kind of saying if you want to understand even contemporary families amongst African Americans and how they view child rearing and things like that, you have to understand like there's this longer history that happens, right? And this is the first step of that history. Okay. And this involves, right, and if you look on page 56, it starts getting into this. It involves things like communal sort of child rearing, right? Is very common among slaves. So like, you know, who's watching after the child is not necessarily important because you're one extended family, right? So very different attitudes. So thinking about going back to the idea of like grandmothers watching children and things like that, right? These would be very natural notions in the past as well, right? Somebody you trust, it doesn't really matter who, can be looking after your children, right? It doesn't have to be you individually, personally, in that sort of white suburban ideology, right? That's kind of what we're pointing to. We're out of time. So I'm actually going to just keep on going with Collins when we get back. We'll get through this chapter, and then we'll take a look at some of the images. I'll probably do that chapter a little more briefly. But yeah, we'll keep on rolling forward. Just keep up with the readings. We will catch up. So thank you guys. Have a great day.
So the literature review is due next Friday?